Thank you so much for having me here. I was really honoured when I got the request to come. As Catherine mentioned, my background was in palliative care, so I started off as a nurse and spent many years working in the palliative care arena. And what led me into psychotherapy was that I would work with people often who were really struggling, not just a patient but families. And the one thing I didn't feel equipped to do was to manage psychological distress. I could do all the medical stuff, but I didn't really know how to manage somebody who was highly psychologically distressed, and that led me down the psychotherapy route. Trained as a psychotherapist and started to at one point I was doing both careers. I was doing part-time nursing, part-time psychotherapy, and then eventually I moved more into the mental health arena. One thing led to another. I got the opportunity to write a book. I was doing workshops for BBC. They suggested that I write a book. Somebody at a workshop randomly said, have you ever thought about putting all this content into your book? I sat down and wrote the book thinking if 10 people read the book, that would be great. And the book has sold in 13 countries worldwide, which I think is kind of testament to the epidemic of mental health. And I think more and more this is becoming a problem. So today I'm going to be talking to you for about 20 minutes about the content of the book, what it's about. Then there'll be a chat. I say 20 minutes, I'm from Ireland. If I get this done in 20 minutes, that'll be a bloody miracle. But I'm relying on Catherine pulling me back. Then we're going to have a little fireside chat. I'm told there's a gin and tonic here, which would be lovely. And then I'm going to open it up to the floor. And the one thing I'd really encourage you to do is I've been to hundreds of conferences over the years, and there is nothing worse than having a day of being talked at. And I'd really encourage you to interact, because mental health isn't just about me as a professional. It affects probably everyone in this room. And I'd be confident to say that every person in the room will have been affected by anxiety, depression, panic attack, phobia, trauma. If it's not you specifically, it'll be a husband, wife, partner, daughter, son. Mental health is epidemic, and if we tell ourselves that it's not our problem, then we're kidding ourselves. This impacts on everyone, so hopefully there's some relevance in what I talk about. An old supervisor of mine years ago said, if you're ever given a talk, never ever kick off with your subject. Tell a different story. And actually, I thought it was really odd advice, but every time I do a talk now, I follow his advice. And today I'm going to talk about an odd thing that happened to me around mistaken identity recently. And I was at an event. It wasn't anything to do with the book. It was just a social event. And a guy came up to me and he said, could I have a picture with you? Which was the oddest thing in the world. I mean, I've written a book, but I'm not an X Factor or anything. So it was a really odd thing. So I kind of sheepishly said, yeah, it'll be fine. And I thought, why is this guy asking? But anyway, I stood back. And as we were about to have the photograph taken, he said, are you still playing? And I said, playing what? And he said, are you still playing football? And I thought, well, I've never played football in my life. So I thought, oh my God, this guy's got it wrong. And I said, I don't play football. And he said, are you sure? And I said, no, trust me, I'm positive. And he said, are you not Gaza? And I said, no, I'm not Gaza. So that's my claim to fame. And ironically, a week later, I was in Belfast for a weekend, and a guy stopped me, and this is not a word of a lie, a guy stopped me, and he said, oh, how are you? And when I go back home, I've been gone for about 20 years, but often I go back and I don't recognize people because I've been gone for so long. And he said, God, I haven't seen you in a while. How have you been? I said, yeah, I'm good. And he said, when did you get out? And I said, what do you mean? And he said, oh, we were inside together. We were in prison together. Do you not remember me? The wrong person. So within the space of a week, I was a convict and Gaza. So anyway, so that's my mistaken identity stories. And actually, it's probably thematic, because I think around mistaken identity, we all have an identity that we bring to our life and to our world. And often that identity, it's not that real, because we bring a persona. You know, we're strong, we're the professional, but actually what we bring is we bring a story. And very often, even in the workplace, we bring vulnerability, and that's really, really difficult. So you're all in senior positions and you're managing teams and you've got people working for you, but you bring real life into work. And that could be money problems, it could be finance, it could be kids, it could be health problems. You know, you don't stop functioning as a human being when you go into work. But then we get into work and we have all of these demands placed on top of us. What percentage of companies do you think are reporting staff feeling overwhelmed? Just a ballpoint figure. I'm just going to grab water while you're thinking. What were the figures?
80.
Okay. Any others?
60.
Okay. The evidence, Forbes did a big study about a year, I think it was about 2 years ago, and they reported that 75% of companies were reporting staff claiming they were overwhelmed. which I think is quite incredible. Now, other studies are reporting differently. There was one come out 2 weeks ago saying that 75% of people in day-to-day life were reporting feeling overwhelmed, which is just phenomenal. People are really, really struggling to cope. And I think the interesting thing about this for me, from my point of view, is that most people are struggling, but the majority aren't reaching out for help. And I think that's a travesty. And I really want you to bear that in mind today, because the people that you're managing, the people who work within the hospice movement, all of you are in difficult environments. You know, working in that environment is not easy. It's a highly stressed environment. But not only is it highly stressed, the expectations are really, really high. I've worked in palliative care and I know what it's like in a hospice. People expect the best, and rightly so. But actually, expecting the best and delivering that all of the time is a real challenge. So I think within hospice movements, what you get a lot of the time is a lot of challenge and a lot of pressure to be the best, and sometimes that can be difficult to achieve. So what I talk about in 10 to Zen, the book, is teaching people how to manage the mind, because our minds create a lot of problems. And I'm just going to throw this out for a moment. I want you to think about, I just want you to think about this morning. Let's start with this morning, really, and I just want you to raise your hand. I won't put anyone on the spot. Have you taken 10 minutes today to do practical things like cooking food, making breakfast? And if you have, just raise your hand for me. Okay, it's the majority of people in the room. Have you all taken at least 10 minutes today to have a shower, have a wash, freshen up? Okay?
Nearly
Good.
everyone.
Good. That's very good to know. Has anyone taken 10 minutes out today to look after their mental health in any way, shape or form? Okay. Now that's interesting. That's 3 people in the entire room. Now normally when I go into huge corporate gigs, there can be 400 or 500 people in the room. If I go into to banks or people in the city, I ask that question and I rarely don't get any. Now that really, really astounds me, because our mental health and our minds create most of the problems in our life. Because what goes on in here dictates the content of your day. And often what's going on in here is quite difficult, because we're all moving at speed. We're all doing too much. We're all really in the fast lane all of the time. We're thinking too quickly, we're processing too quickly, and a lot of the time we're feeling quite anxious. And I'm not saying that broadly. The research is indicating this really, really clearly. When we stop people and do random blood pressure checks, a lot of people's blood pressure is higher than it needs to be. When we do stress evaluations, we discover that a lot of people are really, really highly stressed. And that's because of how they're managing their mind. And it's interesting, we will all focus on our body, we'll focus on food, we'll focus on lifestyle, we'll do all of this stuff, but we won't take time out to look after our minds. So when I created the book, the premise behind it was, it was going to be 10 minutes a day. And the story behind that was, I was looking after a lady I was working with, and she was highly, highly anxious and very depressed for a long number of years. And I was trying to teach her meditation techniques. And she was a character and very, very funny and very, very straight to the point. And I'd set her a technique to practice mindfulness for 30 minutes a day. She got back to session and I said, oh, how's it all going with the mindfulness? And she said, are you having a laugh? And I said, is it not working? And she said, where the bloody hell am I going to get 30 minutes a day to meditate? You know, I've got a husband, I've got 4 kids, I've got a full-time job. I haven't got 30 minutes to meditate every day. And that got me to thinking about time. I wanted to create a program that was time efficient. It's only 10 minutes a day. And from that, what I discovered is when I started to teach the program, most people could commit to that. Most people can commit to 10 minutes a day using the techniques to quieten their mind. I want to ask another question. Now, this is a difficult question, and again, I don't want to ask anybody to share anything personal with me, but if you've ever felt stressed, particularly in the last year, all I want you to do is just raise your hand. Okay. If you felt overwhelmed at all in the last year, particularly at work, simply raise your hand. Okay. And if you've ever felt that you're just spinning too many plates at one time in your life, raise your hand. Right, there you go. So, you know, this is the majority of the people in the room. You know, this is not an alien concept. Generally, people are feeling stressed. And if we replicated this talk and took it to another company, we'd find the same thing, that people are struggling. And what I tried to teach is, how do you quieten the mind? Because often the activity that goes on in there is chaotic. We need to teach techniques that bring it down notch by notch so that you're not dictated by the content. Because often when your stress levels are high, the problem is our minds they have a mind of their own, literally. And the problem is our brains, when they're in threat mode, are there any clinicians in the room? Okay, great. You can help me out if I get stuck with it. the clinical stuff. Basically, our minds, on the right-hand side of your brain, you've got a part of the brain called the amygdala. And the amygdala is your threat center. Now, if we were in danger today, if something bad happened and we were in imminent danger, our amygdala would kick off and it would get us out of the room quickly. And that would be a good thing. The problem is, for most of us, our amygdalas are activated all of the time, or a lot of the time. And the problem with that is when your amygdala is highly activated, you will feel tense, your body will feel uptight, your heart will be beating quicker, your thought processes will be working much quicker than they need to, and the way you think will be impacted. So the job and the kind of techniques in the book I teach are about how do you deactivate the amygdala? How do you switch that part of the brain off when it's not needed? Because when it's not needed, it needs to rest, and your brain needs to rest. But if your brain's in overdrive all the time, you're going to be tired. Another question, how many people in the room feel more tired than they want to a lot of the time? Right, there you go again. I mean, what do you think, when you look around the room and I ask those questions, what do you think when you see almost every colleague identify with those symptoms? Does it surprise you, or does it make sense? It makes sense, okay. And I think that's the thing around us here, we're all in this together. Now, the problem with overactive thinking and the problem with highly active minds is the type of thoughts it tends to create are really, really problematic. And by that I mean that our thought patterns often get in the way of our life. So most of us, and it doesn't matter what the reasons are, it can be background, it can be family, it can be cultural. I'm an Irish Catholic, so I'm great on the guilt and shame stuff. I can do that one really, really well. So my patterns that get activated are often around guilt and shame, because if it feels good, it's wrong. That was a message I was taught. So I often have to manage. And you will all have a different story. Some of you will have that, some of you will have perfectionism, some of you will have the need to get it right all of the time, some of you might feel the need to fit in, to belong. It doesn't matter what it is, but the problem is that these create thoughts, and often the patterns are stuff like catastrophizing. So you're in a meeting at work and your MD or your manager throws a look at you and you don't quite know what the look means, but your brain could then start to kick off and misinterpret that look as, she thinks you're rubbish at your job. You're going to lose your job. Not only are you going to lose your job, how are you going to pay your mortgage? Who's going to look after the kids? What if I end up in the streets? Can you see where it goes? Often we can have catastrophic ways of thinking if we don't manage our minds. Other thinkings can be perfectionism, that I'm not good enough. Other people are better at me. I should be doing more. I should be doing better. We're all laboured and crippled by often unhelpful thinking patterns. And the travesty of that is that most people don't recognise what their unhelpful thinking patterns are. They buy into it as a normal, and they just talk about, oh, this is normal for me. This is what I do. I'm just a worrier, or I'm a perfectionist. Actually, it doesn't have to be that way. Managing your mind and working with the content is really, really important. So essentially, the relevance to this in terms of the context of what I talk about today is, we're human beings. The people in your workforces are human beings. They're bringing all of this stuff into work. And the reason I go in and I do workshops with organisations is to help people understand their minds and how it works, how that might impact on how they perform in work, how it might impact on how they are as human beings in work, how it might impact on how they communicate in work. Because if we learn to manage our minds better, we function better, we create happier workplaces. I mean, we all know what it's like to be in teams where there's toxic cultures or there's conflict or people who are not getting on together, because often what can happen is our minds can collide. If we're working together and we both have our own stuff going on but we don't understand it, of course we're going to clash and it's going to be fireworks. So it's about teaching people to understand how they can manage all of this. How am I doing?
You're doing all right,
Am
actually.
I doing okay?
You've got another 5.
I'm just waiting on being pulled back any minute. Sat down in the chair. So the last part of the book, I talk about my experience in palliative care, because I think for me that was really, really important. That I didn't want to just talk about psychology. I didn't want to just talk about my experience of what it was like. I grew up in Northern Ireland, by the way. I'm sure you can gather from the accent. And in the book I talk about what it was like to grow up in Belfast during the Troubles, because that was anxiety driven all of the time. And I didn't realise the impact on anxiety until I left Northern Ireland. So it was only when I left and I would hear a car backfire that I would jump, because I would think, oh my God, that's scary. And I hadn't realised how impacted I was with anxiety growing up in Northern Ireland. So I talk about that, but I talk also about What do we learn from people who are at their end of their life? You know, I spent probably nearly 10 years working in the palliative care arena, and you can't not sit with people who are dying every day and with their families and learn something about what makes a better life. And I think it's really, really important that that we take, you know, the lessons from people who are dying about how we value our time, how we value people in our lives. Are we living the lives that we are meant to lead? Because I think very often we're on a treadmill. You know, we're mechanically going through life, paying the bills, getting by, doing what we think we should be doing. But actually when we stop to think, God, am I really, truly doing what puts fire in my belly? Am I doing what puts me in fire? And I think often it's difficult to answer that question because we may not be. So the experience from the dying was really, really important for me. So in a nutshell, this is good gin, by the way. In a nutshell, the premise of my work is really about truly encouraging people to prioritize mental well-being, to realize that taking 10 minutes out of your day is a short period of time, but probably the most important 10 minutes off your day. Because when you learn to manage your mind, when you learn to quieten the activity, when you learn techniques to slow things down a bit, then suddenly you start to feel calmer, you start to feel more regulated, and more importantly, you start to get more focus and more perspective. And the really exciting thing about this for me is that all the research is really, really clear. A quieter mind and a deactivated amygdala increases productivity. People perform better, people function better. Even people who work in creative industries, when I go and work with actors or TV people, the evidence shows us really clearly that they produce better work when they're quieter. And yet, when you go and work with these people, they're on the go the whole time. They feel they have to be doing stuff. They feel they have to be moving all of the time. And yet the evidence is telling us the opposite. When you slow down, you will get more. You will become more creative. So, the impact is significant. There are hundreds of papers out there that can clinically evidence the benefits of quietening the mind. It's not just about that, though. It's about the impact, not only on your life, but I truly believe that when you start to live in a way where you're more functioning, when you're more rational, when you're quieter, when you're stiller, that not only impacts on you, but it impacts on your family. It impacts on the people around you. So it's kind of almost a knock-on effect where it becomes contagious because people will notice a change. If you start to live this way, they will notice that you're feeling just a little bit more chilled. And they'll ask what you're doing, and then you can pass on what's been helpful for you, and it just then builds and builds. And that's kind of part of my mission and my work, is to really try and normalize mental health and get an important message out there, because I think there's a lot of psychobabble out there, and I'm not going to mince my words around that. There's a lot of stuff out there that I think can really confuse people, and what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to place a very common sense voice on mental health. It can be managed, there is hope, and 10 minutes off your day will make an enormous difference to how you manage your life. And I think that's the key things I wanted to talk about. Does that
sounds great? Take a seat, take the weight off.
Thank you.
So I hope you're all thinking. About your questions. I thought I'd just kick off with a few. I think what I found shocking about this whole area is, and looking at I think I was reading some of the latest figures from the CIPD, that mental health is now the #1 cause of long-term absence.
Yeah.
Versus, say, what it used to be was always musculoskeletal, wasn't it? And I find that really scary, and I wondered whether you had a view on why is it so much of an issue, say, in the last 5 years, that trend has happened?
I think it's twofold. I think you're right, 10 years ago it would have been back pain.
Yeah.
And I think what's happened now, there's been a massive cultural shift. People are now talking a little more honestly about mental health. Lots of employers are now taking it much more seriously. So I'll give you an example. I was doing a workshop in a record company recently, and the MD of the record company was saying is that the younger population don't call in with the flu anymore. They call in with anxiety on a day off. Now that's a massive shift that younger people are starting to talk more openly. So I think firstly it's about communication, but I think secondly as well is that we are surrounded by threat. If you look at a textbook definition of anxiety, it's an intolerance of uncertainty. And everywhere you look at the minute, you've got uncertainty, politically, economically, socially, terrorism, everywhere out there, we're surrounded by uncertainty. So I think globally we're living in challenging times, so it's natural that we're going to feel more anxious and we're going to struggle more. But I think that measured against a climate of openness and people encouraging people to talk has created almost a landslide of new mental health awareness, which I think is a good thing. I don't think it's a bad thing.
Yeah.
But I think we've only touched on the problem, if I'm being honest.
I mean, you mentioned just then about quietening the mind.
Yeah.
And I think about the amount of noise that's out there, politically, economically. We won't go into all that, but I mean, that in itself is quite stressful, I find. And then you throw things like the social media platforms into the mix, and that sense of constantly being on email and our sort of mobile way of working. So how do you quieten that mind in that noisy environment, the context that we're living in now?
It's a good question, actually. When I do these talks, I have a slide up, but I deliberately don't use PowerPoints a lot of the time, because I think we're just surrounded by technology and screens, or computer screens, and I think what we don't do enough of is we're not communicating enough with each other. You know, we're just constantly locked. I mean, for those of you who have kids, look at how much time they're spent on Instagram, Twitter. You know, they're just constantly locked. So we're kind of losing that ability to look people in the eye and to communicate with them. And I think part of the challenge is that the more we do that, the more we're disconnecting. So what I talk about is the importance of disconnecting. You know, there's an old cliched saying that everything that's broken, if you unplug it and plug it back in again, it tends to kind of reboot. And I think actually it's probably not untrue. As human beings, I think when we disconnect and unplug, we tend to reboot, and we then tend to level. And I think that's the important things. Our minds are just like any other part of the body. You know, like if I did a marathon a couple of years ago, and by the end of it, my knees and my legs were absolutely done, because, you know, I was training so much. But I learned to rest my body, because it was really, really important. But the one thing that most of us are not doing is we're not learning to rest our minds. So it's an organ, it's a part of the body. Why wouldn't we rest that like we do other parts of the body? If we go to the doctor and they said, oh, you've got a bad back, you need bed rest, you will listen to that. But when we talk about feeling absolutely depleted, demoralized, anxious, struggling, we're not resting our minds. And I think that's the key thing, is taking the time out will rest the mind. But not only will it rest the mind, it will help you proactively avoid burnout or becoming tired further down the line. So it's more preventative.
I'm fascinated that your background is in palliative care, and of course everyone in this room works in palliative care. What experiences have you and insights have you drawn from your experience as a palliative care nurse? But also, what can we learn from people who are dying, their families? You know, there's an opportunity there, isn't there?
I think there's a huge opportunity. Before palliative care, I was in accident and emergency, so it was a completely different ball game. So it was in the fast lane, and then unfortunately my mum got ill back in Northern Ireland, and she ended up under the care of Northern Ireland Hospice. Right. And so I saw the work as a professional. I was able to look at the work they were doing, and they did this incredible job of just managing symptoms and just kind of helping her come to terms with the diagnosis and help us come to terms with it. And it really inspired me I felt when I was doing accident and emergency, I was in the fast lane all of the time, just repairing stuff quickly and then moving people on. And I wanted to do something that had a bit more substance, really, and where I could make more of an impact. And I think hospice care does that, really. And I think there is something powerful, actually, when people are facing their own mortality. Suddenly there is a wake-up call about life. Yeah. And I know that sounds really, really cliched, but I don't think I've ever met anyone in my career who didn't have some insight into how they lived their life, or how they would do it different. I would hear that a lot. If I had it to do again, there are so many things I would do differently. And I lost count of the number of people who would talk about things that they would do differently. And it was often about time, often about work. I mean, this is not for any managers in the room, but they would often say they would do less work, not more. They would take more holidays, they would spend more time with people, their perspective would be different. And the interesting thing about that was often they would throw it back at you, because I would leave. I remember one day I was driving home from a night shift, and I was working in a hospital at the time, and I think 3 people had died in the one shift. And I went home and I was knackered, and I'd get into that shift and I was worried about, I was getting a new mortgage at the time, and my dog was sick, and there was stuff going on in my life. And I can remember feeling really, really stressed and agitated that I had so much going on in my life. And I went in, and I remember coming out at the end of that shift, and suddenly there was an absolute movement of perspective, because suddenly it didn't matter as much. And I think that's where the real teaching is. We we all place way too much importance on stuff that doesn't matter as much as it should do. Does that make sense?
Yeah,
our
completely.
energy and our attention is often in the wrong places, and I think working with people who are terminally ill can often teach you that. That was my experience.
Yeah, I suppose it's sort of, we're working in this quite unique environment in a hospice, and you know, I think we would all hopefully agree that our workplaces are very compassionate towards patients, and I wonder how we become more compassionate employers and workplaces in the hospice sector.
Yeah.
All the compassion is obviously channeled hugely into looking after patient care, but do we look after ourselves enough, I wonder? Again,
I think it's a really important question because, as I said at the beginning, the hospice environment it's a tough one because with excellence you get a demand, and there's a price tag that comes with that. And I think certainly on the clinical, on the floor, on the kind of clinical setting, staff really do struggle at times. And I think they need support, and I know they get a lot of supervision and stuff, but I think then as managers and HR leads, you then have to manage the difficulties that staff present with. And I know you've got all the stuff like grievances and complaints and all of that. And I think when you're in a highly charged environment where people expect a lot, then that's what you're gonna come up against. And I truly believe, I don't think it matters whether it's in hospice care or in a bank or in the television industry. I don't think it matters, but I think taking care of staff is really, really important because, you know, when you've got a happier workforce, you know, it's a nicer place to be, first of all, but secondly, I think just in terms of delivery, you just get much more. And I've seen that in my career where I've worked with teams that were really well supported. And it was just a lovely place to be, and it was a happy place to be, and things went well. But I've also worked in places where support wasn't in place, and you would see the conflict, the tension, people not getting on together, and almost resentful about doing their job. And I think that's a really, really interesting thing. It's about, I think for me, it's about knowing what the needs of your team are, and really observing carefully what the needs of your team are and hearing them, truly hearing what their needs are. And I know no matter what team you ask what they need is, they will tell you lots of stuff, but I think it's about truly listening to what are the specific needs of this team, where are the feelings, where are we lacking, what are the things we could do more of, and particularly around mental health. If you know, for example, if there's nothing in place for good mental health, well, maybe that's a good starting place. You know, what would it be like to allow the team 10, 15 minutes out of their shift or out of their day to recharge? You know, places like Google, some of the big companies have chill areas where staff can go to. Now, I'm not saying that you create a chill area, but what I'm saying is you can think creatively about what would be a first step towards that.
Brilliant. I'd like to open it out now to the floor for a couple of questions. We have Lindsay at the back and Louise over here, so who'd like to ask the first question?
Don't be frightened, I won't bite.
Over here. No, go. Thank you very much. If you could say who you are and where
Thank
you're
you.
from, that would be great.
Hi, I'm Julie Davis. I'm from Hospice of the Good Shepherd. Is that working?
Yes.
I think it is.
Hi.
Thank you, Owen. I really enjoyed that. And
Thank
I'll
you.
confess I haven't read the book, but it's going to be top of my list to go away and purchase one. The answer is probably in the book anyway, but how do you persuade people that are sort of naturally averse to 10 minutes of, again, I don't know what techniques and tools you advocate in the book, but whether it's meditation or journaling or just lying down, breathing, whatever it might be. How do you firstly persuade people that are maybe naturally averse to it, thinking it's all a bit woo-woo, but then also how do you make that transition for us in the room to bring that into the workplace, and where it's even, you know, more of a challenge?
Yeah, it's a really valid point, because I like that expression woo-woo, because when I think it comes to mental health and meditation and stuff, people are expecting something very, very weird and wacky. I know certainly when I go into corporate gigs, I don't know what they're expecting, but you can see that they're quite closed at the beginning to this meditation thing, because it's not quite them. And I think the importance is about making it relevant to people. And I think, you know, meditation could be anything. And of course, meditation is one of the techniques in the book, but it's one of a number of techniques that work quickly for people. But I think when you make it relevant to people and you ask them questions like, are you struggling to sleep? Do you ever have days when you feel it's all a bit too much? Are you struggling to cope sometimes? Are you finding that you get overwhelmed easily? Some of the questions I ask you today, it's about asking those questions, and if people respond and say, yeah, I am, you can then say, well, look, I've got something here that might be really, really helpful. It just teaches you really common sense, practical techniques that will help you manage your mind, because the mind's creating some of those problems, and it will help you regain perspective. So I think it's about using very normal, simplistic, common sense language, because I think if you start going off into neuroscience and evidence-based practice, with the general public, I think they just find that difficult. So I think making it relevant is really, really important, and helping them see that it can help them. Does that answer your question?
Fantastic. Yes, it does. And it also, while you were talking there, I was thinking, it also gives us some tools to be quite proactive with it. Don't wait until they're sort of, right at near breaking point. You can employ some of these strategies early on when they're noticing the signs.
Exactly. And I think this is one of the things, when I was a clinical lead in the NHS, what you would see a lot of people arriving, and thankfully, there is more funding than there was traditionally. Still a long way to go, but you would see people arriving for treatment when they had become unwell. Depression had kicked in, anxiety disorders had started to become more problematic, panic had moved in. Now, the good news is it's all treatable, but of course it takes a bit longer. When you're trying to get someone back to normal equilibrium, that takes a little bit longer. Whereas my argument is, well, how about not going there? How about using techniques that can avoid that? Or even if you are there, the techniques will stop things deteriorating and going further. So again, it's, I talk about this technique almost being like a mind workout, and it literally is training the mind to respond in a different ways. Because if you really engage and listen to all of your mind tells you, you're going to be in trouble. And we really have to learn the art of disengaging from some of the content, because we don't need to.
Fantastic, thank you.
You're welcome.
Who'd like to ask the next question, or perhaps you have a comment or something you'd like to share? Gentleman at the back. Thanks, Louise. If you could just say who you are and where you're from, that would be great.
Oh, thanks. My name is Jeffrey Achul, and
Hi.
I work for Mighton Hospice. So we're
Hi,
just 5
Jeffrey.
minutes down the road from the Hilton. Just to say, I do really subscribe to all the things you've just said about mental health, because certainly one of the big reasons why people go off within my organization is to do with mental health.
Yeah.
As an employer, we've been trying to think of the different things we can do to try and support our staff as well.
Yeah.
And certainly the 10 minutes thing that you've just mentioned, I think that's one thing that we will certainly want to take on board. The other point, though, is we've been looking at all the things to do with mental health. So what are the things that we could offer to our staff? And wherever you look around nowadays, you see things about mental health first aid. And I'd just like to get your views on that, because we've been thinking along the lines of, should we try and encourage our line managers, for instance, to undertake the so-called mental health first aid training program? So the problem is you're getting bombarded with all sorts of different people now offering you mental health first aid training. So I just want to get your views on what do you think about mental health first aid, and whether organizations like ourselves should be encouraging line managers to undertake something like that.
Okay, it's a really good question. There's a lot of mental health first aid out there, and of course I'm not going to criticize it, because I think any response to mental health is a good response. So I would prefer people respond than not respond, and like any accident or any injury or illness, to respond in some way is really, really important. So I think that it's good that we have that in place. However, I suppose what I'm more interested in is healthy mental wellness as a lifestyle, not just something that's to be responded to as a first aid emergency. I'm interested in people making fundamental changes to their life, where it just doesn't become responding to a crisis in the moment, but they learn ways of living this particular way. It's a bit almost like, when you change your diet and you suddenly decide that you're going to follow a particular path on how you eat food. For that to work well, it needs to be continuous. It needs to be maintained, and it needs to become part of a lifestyle. So I think it's good that they're there, and I think that they're helpful because you recognize symptoms and you can encourage people to get help. But I think the bigger question is that it's not just about responding as a first aid emergency, it's about we need to change cultures more significantly, and we have to embody mental wellness as a normal part of functioning and as a normal part of how we treat people, because I think for years mental health was a dirty secret. It was a thing that we didn't talk about, it was put away. People didn't want to know because there was so much stigma around what it was, you know, what does it mean if someone has a mental health problem? It doesn't mean anything, it means that they're human. Everyone in the room has the capacity to struggle with mental health, and we will all have the capacity to struggle with mental health as long as we're human. So I'm more interested in normalising, I'm interested in our humanity, and I'm interested in this as a way of life. Does that answer your question?
Hello. Yeah,
Hi.
Thanks very much for your answer. I think the best thing for us could be that perhaps you come and work with us for the next few months or so.
That could be arranged.
Take a question, hit down here, Louise, please.
Okay, Claire Gale from St Luke's Hospice.
Hi, Claire.
Harrow and Brent, hi. I obviously haven't read the book yet. It sounds very interesting. It's lots of things resonate with me. I'm just wondering, are there sort of techniques in there? Obviously, as an individual person, I can see how I could benefit.
Yeah.
But as HR leads, obviously, I'm looking at the well-being of the organisation. Are there sort of techniques in there that we could use, or ideas that we could, or would you be suggesting that we encourage people to read the book individually?
Yeah, I mean, the book's really practical and pragmatic.
Yes.
So it does. I use techniques from mindfulness. I'm trained in different models of therapy. So I trained in cognitive behavioural therapy, which is kind of how we think. I trained as a mindfulness teacher, so that really teaches about how we live in the moment. I also am a trauma trained therapist, so I used a model called EMDR, which treats people who have got post-traumatic stress disorder. But I use techniques from there that help people ground, which means you teach the brain to switch off very quickly. When you're treating people with trauma, what you need to do is you need to ground them, and they need to be focused and settled before you start doing trauma work. So there's techniques in there in terms of how do we ground, how do we switch off, how do we quieten. So I use a number of different techniques, but in a very kind of, you'll see it when you read the book, but it's literally laid out minute by minute what the 10-minute looks like, and it's literally a paint by numbers, step by step. Okay, the first part of the technique is stop, and I know that sounds like really, really obvious, but most people don't know how to stop. And then I talk about using techniques, how to use the breath effectively, because it's a really powerful tool to bring things down. So there's a really, really concrete, clear way of, okay, what would the first 4 or 5 minutes look like to try to bring things down notch by notch. Then when you've done that, I move into, okay, how are you going to manage the unhelpful thoughts, the thinking patterns that get in the way? So I kind of then build into that. And then the third layer moves into, okay, not just to go back to the gentleman's question, this is not just about first aid. How are you then going to make fundamental changes to your life? What are the things that need further thought? What are the things that need further evaluation? And I suppose my argument would be that, if you pick up the book, and I don't want to sound like I'm doing a sales pitch, but if you pick up the book and it's effective for you as an individual, then chances are it then might be effective for you as a team, within HR, and it could be then that whether it's my techniques or other techniques out there, you could then roll that out to the organisation broadly. So I think, start with the individual, roll it out into smaller teams, and then roll it out organisationally. That's how I've seen it work effectively and well. I have to be honest, if I don't practice this stuff every day of my life, I don't function well. The quality of my day changes significantly. Often I'm giving talks, workshops, I'm writing the second book at the minute, so the demands are there. I've got a life like everyone else. If I don't use the stuff that I preach, then I struggle. And I really notice a difference when I don't use it. I'm grumpy. I'm more irritated. Things really bother me. Somebody recently rammed a trolley into me in Waitrose. I'm bloody furious. And it was on a day when I hadn't practiced. When you feel a proper overreaction because somebody's just bumped their trolley into you. So I think it's about, this is a way of life, really.
Thank you, that's very helpful.
Welcome.
I'm interested in that cultural piece, and I just wondered, to open it out to the floor a little bit, if anyone feels that they've made progress in changing the culture around mental health in your own hospices, and if so, if you'd be willing to just share some of the things that you've done, or someone that is actually perhaps struggling with changing the culture in their hospice. Thank you.
I'm quite loud, I didn't need one. I think it must be something about the profession. So I'm Laura, I'm the Director of HR for Garden House Hospice.
Hi, Laura.
When I got to the hospice 2.5 years ago, I came from a retail world, so very different to palliative care that I now know. But when I got there, when we talk about long-term sickness around mental health, we had 6 people off long-term sick around mental health. And I'm really proud that actually by opening up this discussion around mental health, we at the moment have no one off with long-term sickness around mental health.
Right.
Because actually it's about, you know, they may get a medical certificate in the first instance for a couple of weeks, but opening up that discussion at the earliest opportunity with them, meeting them off site, you know, going for a coffee and bringing it back down to them and about them instead of making it around work.
Yeah.
And we've seen some really fantastic progress around that. So, you know, at the earliest opportunity, getting employee assistance programs in and counselling and things, and really opening up the discussion that it's okay to not be okay at that moment, but what can we do practically to support them? And we've done a lot of work around reasonable adjustments. You know, if they've had a bereavement, we know that that is going to affect their mental health and well-being. And, you know, they work in palliative care. So actually, let's look at how we can get them back to work in a different role to support them whilst they're going through any form of counselling or treatment. And whilst we've done that, actually, we've seen some massive improvements around it.
Brilliant, good. And I think, again, it goes back to that whole point about normalising. I think, you know, I think sometimes it's difficult. Staff, when organisations tell them to do stuff, will react. You know, if I can imagine as HR, if you went in and delivered a talk, staff will be a bit like, well, that's just HR giving me the talk. And I think, you know, choose people to go in and talk to your organisations, people who you think they will relate to and that are credible. I think this is part of the difficulty. I've seen workshops delivered in this here that would make me run 1,000,000 miles. Because it's just too wacky or it's too scary. So I think it's about making it relatable, normalising it, and getting that message across to your staff in some way. Because the moment you open the door to conversations, because even today I'm confident that some of what I will have said today might have even sparked some curiosity in your own mind about aspects in your own life or someone else in your life. So I think that's all you're aiming to do, is to spark curiosity, to get people to start taking an interest in how they manage their life, how they manage their minds. That's a really positive step forward. If you do that, you've achieved a lot, because the problem is most people don't invite that. And that's the travesty out there. That invitation isn't out there. So I think you've done some really great stuff there, and I think, you know, I certainly encourage other organisations to open up the conversations, not to be frightened of it. You know, there's nothing that is going to surprise you. You will have heard it all before, in one way, shape or form, but I think it's about putting it out there and letting people say, okay, this is fine, you know, this is normal and I can be supported with this, and it's not a bad thing. That's the key message. This is not a bad thing. It's part of being human. And keeping it very light. I think this is the thing with mental health. We can often get very, very frazzled by it, and we get a bit hysterical about it. You know, like, we're all on a trajectory, aren't we, as human beings? We all wake up some days and we can feel a bit flat, or we can feel a bit anxious. We're all wavering up and down. And that's the reality of mental health. That's all it is, simply. As human beings, we waver and we vary. And wouldn't it be a great thing to learn how to manage those variations? It's a bit like, I was talking to Virgin Atlantic recently, and halfway through the talk, this was my own analogy, by the way, but I was really proud of it. And I was talking about to them about their staff and how they manage stress, and I was thinking, well, I imagine it's a bit like a pilot in turbulence. You know, a pilot in turbulence will have to reduce speed, you know, adjust the wings a little bit. They might even have to, you know, move to a different altitude to get through turbulence. And I think as human beings, we're a bit like that. When we go through a tough time, or your teams go through a tough time, we might have to reduce speed or pull back, or change direction, or change altitude. We might have to make some adjustments or changes to move us forward and to get us there safely. And I think that's what it's all about. This is about, you know, safe, compassionate practice and treating each other as human beings and looking out for each other.
Brilliant. That's all we've got time for, I'm afraid. But treating each other as human beings and looking out for each other, I think, is a really brilliant note to finish on. So if you could just join me and thank Owen for a brilliant talk and
Thank you.
something that affects us all.